Hi guys, welcome back to Research Unpacked from the Informed Performance Podcast. I'm Alistair McKenzie, a sports physio from the UK, and on today's episode we have part 2 with Matthew Buckthorpe. Matt is a sports scientist, strength and conditioning coach and researcher from the UK with a ton of experience working in elite sports setting, and he specialises in late stage on-field rehab. Today's episode, Matt is going to discuss some of his clinical frameworks and perspectives, which he outlined in his 2019 publication describing the 4 pillars of high-quality on-field rehab. Links to all Matt's resources discussed throughout this episode will be available on the show notes.
This episode has been sponsored by Vol Performance, makers of ForceDecks, the world's fastest, easiest and most powerful dual force plate system. ForceDecks can help you to analyse neuromuscular strength, performance and imbalances in your athletes. With an incredibly simple setup and intuitive software, ForceDecks automatically detects over 15 common force plate tests and analyses them with a single click, helping you to collect quick and accurate insights on your athletes. To learn more, head over to our sponsor, volperformance.com.
Listening to Research Unpacked from Informed Performance, and here is today's episode with Matthew Buckthorpe. Matt, thanks for coming back for part 2 of your series. In part 1, we talked about, you talked about a lot about rate of force development and the role of performance and injury. Some excellent insights there, and you also gave some links at the end for our listeners to stay up to date with you. So what we'll do is we're going to bypass all that and we're just going to jump straight into your next series, which is all about high quality rehab. So the papers that we're referring to, you published in the Journal of Orthopedic Sport Physical Therapy in 2019, and they're separated into part 1 and 2. So we're just going to talk about part 1 today, and then in the next part we're going to talk about the follow-up paper. So what was your motivation behind doing this paper? And obviously I know a little bit about your background, but yeah, how come you came to decide to do this clinical commentary, mate?
So I guess Claire Arden's to thank. So I originally this was kind of a conference talk. So I did these conference talks at the Isokinetic conference. So I spoke about on-field rehab and 4 pillars. I think the new camp, I think it was maybe 2017. Potentially or 2018. Yeah, 2017. And then I did the 5-stage one in 2018. And I think it was 2017 year that Claire was on the same panel as me. And she kind of said, she was going to become JOSPT editor. And obviously she'd be interested in packaging that stuff up as a paper. So previously I'd just been doing it as conference talks. And so, yeah, it was kind of an invited request from Claire to basically take the presentation and the tacit knowledge that we were doing and just put it on paper, basically. And so, yeah, that was the basis of it. In terms of paper format, obviously the 4 pillars was developed for a different reason. So the 4 pillars was really not something I was doing on a clinical level to begin. But when I took on an education role with Isokinetic, I wanted to streamline the development of on-field rehab specialists. So obviously the on-field specialist can be anyone really, in terms of you could be a physio, you could be a sport and exercise scientist, an S&C coach, you could be a coach, you could be in terms of technical based coach. And because it could be anyone, I feel it's more around the skills that's required as opposed to the profession. And so what I wanted to do was to create this education pathway in different areas and target the different skill sets that's required for the practitioners. So that's why I kind of thought, okay, what's on-field rehab? What areas do the specialists need to be really strong in, and what's the different areas? So from there, I thought, okay, well, obviously it's, I feel you need to be a good movement coach. You need to be a fitness coach, S&C coach. You need to have a good understanding around the sport, hopefully be a technical coach. And then, of course, an understanding around load management. Now, in sport, you might not do all of them. There might be different people doing them. Because I was training people to do the sole job themselves, I wanted to have education pathways in each of those areas. So I kind of found the 4 pillars was an education focus. Didn't really have an intention of putting it out as a paper, and then Claire Arden kind of gave me a little nudge to put that in JSPT, I'd been looking for ways to try and publish, to be honest. Since going back into industry, it was quite hard to still publish as a practitioner. And so I was moving towards the translational research stuff anyway, so it all kind of made sense.
Thanks, Matt. So let's jump straight in and start with, what are the 4 pillars that create high quality on-field rehab that you discuss in this paper?
Sure, yeah. So as you said, 4 pillars. The first one's movement quality. Now, on-field rehab as a whole is really around bridging the gap between in-clinic or in-gym activity and return to the pitch for the team. So it fits between really your S&C stuff that you're doing and a little bit of rehab indoors and being able to rock up with a team back for training. And so it's a bespoke service that takes people on that journey from very simple movements back to team sport. And in terms of movement quality, what we know is a lot of people go back to sport after things like ACL reconstruction with movement deficits. So if we were to test them, they might have dynamic knee valgus, might have a trunk lean, some pelvic asymmetries in running, jumping, landing, cutting tasks. And mostly what we do is we typically look at quite simple tasks. So someone might do a single leg squat as a screen and think that means that they're moving in a certain way. And again, like everything in sport, we're concerned with the ability to move well under context-specific environments. How can someone change direction whilst with an external focus of attention, maybe some perturbation, thinking about the environment in which they're operating in. And so movement quality really is about transitioning someone from the point of being able to run in a straight line to being able to perform football-specific tasks or rugby-specific tasks or whatever sport it is. And it's about a movement retraining program, much the same as we do a strength training program or power development program. So using a periodized movement restoration program to go from linear running through to multi-directional and then sport-specific movements as well. And the viewpoint is to really have someone moving well under realistic situations. So that's kind of the movement pillar. The physical fitness pillar really is about prepping people for the demands of the sport, but also making sure that you've restored their sport-specific fitness profile. Now, this is really, I've never really got this in private practice, and I know a lot of teams are doing it, but rehab, like return to sport criteria, generally involves very little in the way of performance testing. So everything's about, right, you've done your ACL, okay, let's look at your hop distance, let's look at your IKDC, or, let's do a stability test, let's look at pain, swelling, range of motion, maybe an isokinetic test if you're lucky, and maybe some hamstring strength. But none of that reflects the ability to play sport. So you're doing return to sport testing without understanding any performance factors. And the second pillar really is, can someone cope with the demands of their sport without showing adverse fatigue? And have we actually restored their fitness profile? So basically, do your needs analysis, create your pre-season screening in essence, and then run that pre-season screen with your player and understand whether or not they've restored their performance. And people should be finishing on-field rehab very close to their previous fitness levels. So basically, you just do pre-season testing at the end of that process, which I don't know why it hasn't really happened very much in private practice. I presume it's happened a lot in football. At least it was at the clubs I've been with. And so, second pillar is cope with the demands of sport. Make sure that you're mimicking the physical intensity of training. And basically, by the end of the on-field process, people should be working at the intensities in which they'll do in training so that they're ready for that. But you're also doing your additional fitness top-ups to make sure they're fit enough. Pillar 3 is technical tactical. So basically, again, much the same as someone should be able to run, jump, change direction at speed, they should be able to pass, header, cross, tackle. So they should be able to do all of those technical tasks, and they should have restored an element of decision making and thinking. Now, tactical restorations are not going to happen during on-field rehab. One of those reasons is typically because the coach you're with might not be as good as a tactical coach. And I don't think an on-field rehab specialist needs to be as good as a proper coach. And what I mean by that is, you can bring in you say it's a first team, I don't know, whatever club, you can bring in your coach to help you with your technical drills, of course. But I don't feel you need to be a pro licensed coach to be a good on-field technical coach, in that most of what you're doing is controlled drills, maybe sidestepping into a pass, maybe a couple of two-touch drills, maybe there are a couple of set-piece stuff, maybe it's crossing, finishing, maybe you're really trying to mimic the physical demands and some of the technical tasks, but it's not very tactical focus because you only have one-on-one or two players. So it's not an 11v11 situation. So pillar 3 really is about getting people ready to go back to training so that they've practiced all of the relevant tasks. And I've heard stories where people have gone back after, an ankle fracture. Their first training session back, they've redone their ankle on their first pass because they haven't done any passing as part of on-field rehab. And so they should be practicing all of those tasks. You wouldn't ask someone to go back to training without changing direction. And they shouldn't be going back to training without crossing the ball or shooting or passing. So it's prepping for those technical demands. And then the last one is load management. So basically making sure that they've trained enough, they've developed that chronic workloads, that when they go back, they're able to cope with the demands of training and match play. Because we do know that when you expose people to training, you're going to get that cumulative fatigue. So people are going to show fatigue in response to training sessions. And if they've not developed that fatigue resistance, then the risk of muscle strains, the risk of overload, and a spike in acute chronic workloads is going to happen. So it's just really making sure they've got a sufficient volume of training, that they're prepped for the demands of team training and subsequent match play. And I say team training because after a long-term injury, people shouldn't be going straight back into match play. They should have an extended period of training. Much the same as, and again, I've never really got this concept where people go straight from rehab and they'll play a match within 2 or 3 weeks. And that will hopefully you'll be like, well, we'll never do that. But I've had lots of patients that have gone back to certain clubs, not really in the UK, but in other countries where they've played them on the first Saturday, first Sunday. You sent them back within 7 days, they're playing a full match. And it's a bit silly. And I think it's because people don't recognize the difference between being able to train and being able to play a match. And they are massively different. But most of the difference is on a tactical level. There's a big difference between a 2v2 and 11v11 situation in terms of the environment. And there's a big difference in workloads. So people should be going back to team training or modified training. Then they should have an extended period, much the same as we have a preseason. And, you'll have a 6-week preseason following a 6-week off period. So why do people have a 2-week preseason following a 9-month injury? Doesn't really make sense. So yeah, pillar 4 is really about exposing them to training, getting those training adaptations, building that robustness, building that resilience, and getting them ready for coping with the demands of training and match play.
Yeah, so for me, when I read the paper, the 4 pillars, as you've discussed, are almost like a checklist just to ensure that you are producing a comprehensive rehab when transitioning through the different processes from gym-based to on-field and return and all the way through. So let's take this chance. Let's look into pillar 1, movement quality, in a bit more detail. Can you share some of the ideas of how you approach this aspect of on-field rehab? Yeah,
of course. So as you said there, first, it's for me on a movement level, I really like to use movement continuums as part of rehab, making sure that as part of that movement theme, it runs right the way throughout rehab. And movement retraining starts really early. And so saved on an ACL, your movement retraining starts with gait restoration, making sure that you've got sufficient walking gait. Then you're looking at bilateral squatting. Then you're looking at maybe progressing to some unilateral loading and on from there. And so I like to use a movement continuum, making sure that people can perform each task with good competency. So looking at their kinematics, making sure they've got good technique. Doesn't need to be really advanced, just needs to be, can this person perform this task proficiently well? And they shouldn't progress to a more complex task until they're really able to do that. Where people don't want to start to get too picky is perfection isn't always necessary to progress to another task. Now, you don't need a perfect bilateral squat to be able to start some unilateral loading. It needs to be good, but not perfect. And sometimes people get so focused on perfection that they forget that they're just trying to transition through these stages, and you've got to get them to the end. So obviously there it's about looking at the competency, but thinking around, okay, this movement continuum should be based on complexity and intensity, in that every task has a certain load characteristic associated with it. So walking will have, 1 to 2 times body mass per step, but the rate of loading is going to be very different to, say, jogging. Where jogging now, we're going to get 2 to 3 times body mass per step in terms of the vertical ground reaction forces, but now the rate of loading is starting to increase. And so I like to think of it in terms of peak external ground reaction forces. So how much body weight is going through that person? What's the rate of loading? So how fast is that load delivered? So normally looking at things like ground contact time becomes quite relevant, and how fast can they perform these tasks? And then other things we can start to think about clinically is how can you manipulate that? So how can you get rid of the external loading potentially? So that's why I like using things like hydrotherapy and sand, where you can get rid of the external, you can reduce the external ground reaction force. So I like to think of task constraints, like have a movement continuum in place. How can you manipulate those tasks with different environments and different intensities, for example? And then using a combination of that movement continuum mixed up with some technical based stuff as well, in terms of you have to do each task really well, and then it's just progressing through those tasks. If someone's moving reasonably well in all of these tasks, you don't have to do a movement screen for every single task. Just look at their technique. When they're pretty good, progress them to a more advanced task. And in the end, what we're trying to do is take people from walking through to high intensity and reactive movements under a football specific situation. There's probably around a good 80 different tasks that are relevant through that continuum. We've just got to tick each one off in a row. And so I like to do things like task progressions. So number of tasks that you've got to achieve along the way. Once you're able to do that task, tick it off. It doesn't mean you forget that task. It just means on a movement competency level, you can perform it. You might still perform that task, but now you'll do it at higher intensities or higher volumes. For instance, like once you can do a bilateral squat, you don't stop squatting. You just add load, of course, to make it a strength exercise. So, yeah, I think there I'd mix in kinematic and kinetic. The kinetic stuff is thinking about what's the intensity of those movement demands and just progressing through your continuum from walking through to return to play, essentially.
So the next pillar is the physical conditioning pillar. So can you discuss how you establish and monitor the physical conditioning adaptations through the rehab process?
Yeah, cool. Yeah, so obviously, first point there is training. Our on-field rehab is a training stimulus, so we should be getting sufficient training adaptations from that. And the on-field rehab has cardiovascular adaptations associated with it, but also neuromuscular adaptation. So on-field is conditioning. It's not just about ticking off this box to get people psychologically ready and make sure that they can perform these tasks, but there is a big conditioning benefit associated with that. And on a cardiovascular level, it's making sure that you're challenging the energy system sufficiently, and you're getting a sufficient intensity and volume to bring about improvements in aerobic and anaerobic fitness. And what we'd be thinking there on it is what's the internal loading associated with on-field rehab. So of course, use your GPS technology, have your stages in place, know the work demands that you want to hit. But then of course, look at the internal workload of that patient. So use heart rate technology to look at the cardiovascular response. And really what we're making sure is that someone's getting a sufficient intensity of work to bring about those adaptations. And the important thing here, though, is also noting that the cardiovascular workloads, if you're causing fatigue to someone, what are you causing fatigue under? So you've got to make sure it's under a relevant situation, because if you're just introducing cutting, then you don't want to fatigue them under that task, because that task should first be done at fresh, under a quality situation, and then after that you might fatigue them further down the line. So when you're looking at your heart rate monitoring, where are you getting that heart rate response? Because it could be for two reasons. It could just be, I just want to get a heart rate response here. Then you can do that during off-feet conditioning. Take them into the gym or put them in a pool, do some deep water running, do some off-feet conditioning. But if you want to get it under a specific situation, then we need to know what situation you're getting it under. So I like to first do the conditioning stuff off feet in stage one, although I'm not going to talk too much about stages yet. But so that just means that I'm trying to get quality of work when someone's fresh. so all their movement stuff when they're fresh. And then I want to get separate cardiovascular conditioning because I don't think they're ready to do those movements when fatigued. And then as you progress through, you start to get similar cardiovascular responses, but under relevant situations. So by the end of the periods, you're using football techniques to do their fitness. You do football fitness work. And you're using football simulation drills to get the cardiovascular response. In terms of the heart rate zones, obviously, typically people will either use arbitrary zones or they use the lactate threshold. So lactate threshold, typically referred to as the lactate response, of course, is the blood lactate response. So you work it a little bit anaerobically, you produce blood lactate because the pyruvate can't go into the Krebs cycle. So it forms lactate. So pyruvate forms hydrogen, goes out the muscle. You get the blood lactate within the muscle. And you can read that blood lactate as a work intensity. So the higher the blood lactate, the more anaerobic work that's going on. We know that 2 millimolar represents kind of the first threshold and 4 millimolar is the second threshold. So anything above 4 millimolar is going to really be challenging you anaerobically, and you've only got a certain amount of work in which a certain amount of time you can sustain that workload. So working between 2 and 4 millimolar in terms of your lactate response, you've got a longer period of time in which you can do that. So you've got your aerobic really and your anaerobic thresholds. So isokinetic, our conditioning test was a running test at lactate, running speed at lactate threshold. So we would go through the incremental treadmill and just take blood lactate measures and then look at what's the running speed at lactate threshold. And then we would use heart rate off that. So if your lactate threshold occurs at 87% heart rate, that would be your set. Obviously, you can do arbitrary heart rate zones if you don't have access to lactate threshold testing. So we typically use maybe a 70 to 85% as an arbitrary threshold. And then anything over 85%, we presume reflects that 4 millimolar anaerobic threshold. So yeah, you can do testing. On field level, I didn't really do lactate testing during on-field rehab. I'd normally just use heart rate response. Obviously, you have your live GPS and heart rate ideally with you while doing the session. And then just make sure that you're getting a sufficient cardiovascular stimulus during that session as well.
And that brings us on to pillar 3, sport-specific, technical and tactical. So what are some of your approaches around integrating technical and tactical demands into the rehab process?
Yeah, sure. So I normally start, of course, technical, quite controlled drills. And it really depends on the injury to some extent as well. So obviously, if it's an ACL, your risk of re-injury there is, going to be higher than in terms of the technical based drills. If someone has a slip and has gone into a position that's not great, so maybe a really wide foot stance and collapsing into dynamic knee valgus, that's quite possible early on. So you don't want to expose them to a situation there where you haven't got a lot of control. So I'd normally start out with severe injuries quite with a technical closed situation, so very discrete tasks, volleys, little flick ups, where they've got a bit of control and they're less likely to reach for the ball. And then obviously in terms of setting up, I like to break it down into small one-on-one situations, small group situations, and then team-based situations as well. And all you can do really with on-field rehab is one-on-one, transitioning to small group. So all of my early stuff starts one-on-one. I generally like doing it because you've got a little bit more control. In that if that person gets re-injured, really it's on you as the practitioner. So if you are pairing off patients, or if you're bringing in a different player, you need to make sure you've got an element of control there because you don't want too much risk. And I do like to introduce technical stuff relatively early because you want to get the player doing those drills. It's safer to wait until the end, but that's obviously going to be at the detriment of their performance when they go back. So you want to introduce them reasonably early on, but you should do it in a quite a controlled way. So I normally start out with discrete tasks, volleys, little different, whether it's straight on, inside foot, pick up volleys, different keep up drills, more just to get them touching the ball really. And then of course just progressing through simple passing drills, 2-touch drills, and then obviously working your way up through long passing, shooting, etc. Much the same way as your movement progressions, you've got that technical based continuum. Tactical stuff, probably can start a little bit earlier under different situations. So this is where it probably hasn't entered too much out in private practice. I don't really know how much is done in teams at the moment, but players should be, watching games. Players should be probably in and around the performance analysis department, looking at going through different set pieces and phases of play, and should be looking to try and rebuild that tactical knowledge of the sport. They shouldn't have too long away from that. I've never focused too much on that, really. On a tactical level, it's really, for me, when they head towards the end of on-field rehab, you start to think about position-specific scenarios. So if they're a central midfielder, are you setting up your passing drills for the way they're going to be receiving the ball? The same with a wide midfield player and a fullback. Are you mimicking the physical and technical situation as well? So I generally start out quite basic, same, just technically based drills for everyone. Can they volley? Can they pass? Can they header? And then it goes more position specific towards the end. Tactically, it's pretty basic on a coaching level in terms of, if you haven't got large groups, you can't do a lot of tactical stuff, because tactical is really about phases of play and decision making, and are you in the right position? Are you pressing at the right time and at the right speed? And of course, you can introduce some of that with 1v1 situations where you're getting that person to come and press you, and you do your 1v1 situations there. But most of the on-field stuff is small group, and for me, tactical based awareness is where you go to large team situations, 11v11s.
And then just rounding off with pillar 4, which is progressing chronic training loads, predominantly around external training loads using GPS metrics and so forth. So can you just discuss a little bit more detail around this pillar and what it entails for us as practitioners?
Yeah, sure. So obviously, here's looking at the distinctions across different metrics, of course. So, obviously we're going to be thinking, what's the volumes in each of the total distance, the jog distance becomes a bit more relevant. So normally what we look at in football is, you'll just say, okay, total distance, high speed running, sprint distance, but running distance will become relevant in rehab as well. And to some degree, jog distance as a metric, because we want to first develop jogging distance and then running distance and then high speed running distance, because the first time someone enters on-field rehab, they've probably ran at maybe 12, 13k an hour potentially. So they've not really got a massive volume at that speed. And I think one of the hard bits here for practitioners is knowing what the starting value is. So I feel that in the end, we always know what the end value is. We know what we want to get to typically. And generally it's around about 90% of what they're doing in training, or maybe a chronic workload of 70% of their pre-injury value. So we'll set your chronic workloads and you say, there's your target. But we don't really know what the starting volumes are. We don't really know what people have done before. That's because we're not really using accelerometers generally. Depends on the person, the practitioners, the environment. But a lot of people aren't using accelerometers during the indoor stuff. So we don't know what volume of workload someone's accumulated there. And, plyometrics are a form of developing lower limb volumes. The amount of foot contact you're getting, that very closely mimics the biomechanics of the tasks we're doing outside. So if you do a single leg landing, that reflects a lot of the load demands that you get with each step when you're running. So what I like to do is first make sure that someone's done enough landing, plyometric, ballistic stuff, enough eccentric strength training, and enough indoor functional stuff before they've gone outside. And then from there, it's just saying, okay, well, we're just going to progressively develop volumes in each of the successive intensities. So we're going to start out with running volume, make sure that you're able to comfortably cover, 1,500 to 2,000 meters over 15k an hour. And then, won't again talk too much about stages, but then it's a case of going, okay, high speed running, you're not going to start at the beginning, because their first on-field session, they might be running at 12, 13, 14, 15k per an hour. So you're not going to hit high speeds. So the first bit is get some running volumes, then start to get some high speed volumes, then start to get some sprint volumes and some accels and decel volumes as well. And in essence, you're just guessing what someone's at in terms of what they can do, because we don't fully know the equatable workloads that they've done indoors. We can guess it to some degree, but we don't really know how much prep that someone's had there. And it's just gradually progressing session on session, really. I wouldn't say there's like this perfect progression. So in some of the papers I've done, I've had to put, what should you put at each of the thresholds? But really, your GPS there for me is not prescriptive. You shouldn't prescribe the first 2 sessions, 3 sessions, 4 sessions with GPS. You just, you use your experience, you run through the session, and then you look at your GPS metrics potentially after, at least early on. And then you compare that GPS alongside soreness measures, alongside pain and swelling, and, the clinical measures as well, because workload is just one of them. You need to look at not just the workload, but the athlete's response to such workload. So early on, generally a little bit more cautious. As long as I've had good prep, they shouldn't be a massive issue. What we used to have years and years ago is people used to go onto the on-field and they get a lot of bone bruising and a lot of swelling and knee pain in the first 2 or 3 sessions because they've not had a good enough plyometric prep. And you shouldn't be running unless you've done plyometrics beforehand. The same with return to running. Like, how many people do return to running and they haven't done any landing or plyometric stuff? These are all prep exercises for being able to cope with that demand. So really what I do is set a starting value that I typically like. But that's normally experientially based and also taking into account what they've done. And then have the pain swelling markers. And then as long as someone's pretty good, you just progress it the next session. And I wouldn't really, I don't overly focus, maybe as a different practitioner, I don't overly focus on GPS. I focus more on experience, more on the other pillars, if I'm being really honest. So I'm much more concerned with someone's movement capabilities than I am with their GPS in the first periods. Much more concerned with, are they doing these drills in the right technique? So more around quality than quantity of work. But of course, as we get towards the end, you've got to build those volumes as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks, mate. That's great answers and great insight, I think, for each of those. And you've done really well not to tease out too much about the next paper looking at the stages. So good work on that one. That's going to sum up this part 1 of this paper, of this episode. And in part 2, we're going to carry on looking at the follow-up, which is the 5 stages of high quality rehab. But thanks again for your time with this series, with this part, mate. And really appreciate it. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Ali. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Thanks again to Matt for sharing his insights around constructing high quality on-field rehab, and stay tuned for part 3 where Matt discusses the second part of this paper series, summarising a 5-stage programme to on-field rehab. To find more Informed Performance content, head to informedperformance.com, where you can find all our episodes as well as articles and courses from top professionals in performance and sports medicine. And don't forget, you can also find us on social media at Informed Performance on Instagram or at InformedPod on Twitter. Thanks for listening to today's episode of Research Unpacked from the Informed Performance podcast. Catch us next time for more performance and sports medicine insights.